What's up everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today we've got Jake Paul against the world, Francis Ngannou against the UFC, and much more. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel to see more videos just like this. Now let's get into it. Jorge Masvidal tells Jake Paul to take his name out his mouth after reports surface of dismal pay-per-view numbers. The statistics are reportedly in and they don't look good. The Jake Paul and Tyron Woodley rematch from December 18th on Showtime Boxing reportedly only made 65,000 buys. If we're to believe the numbers, then this is a terrible showing for Jake Paul, who has been bragging about the number of pay-per-view buys ever since he fought Ben Askren back in April. For that event, the YouTuber turned boxer claimed that he surpassed 1 million pay-per-view buys. While we know that UFC President Dana White is probably grinning from ear to ear hearing about these numbers, it was Jorge Masvidal, another nemesis of Paul's, who was firing the first shot. Case in point, Gamebred posted a photo of Paul on Twitter with a caption that read, "Boy can't afford the big boys. Never again do I want to hear my name associated with the fake. 305 day is coming." Masvidal is referring to his ongoing feud with Paul, who called him out for leaving the Amalie Arena early during his fight with Woodley, which he won by KO in the 6th round. Masvidal immediately fired a response to Paul after that, saying he only fights the best in the world and for big money, neither of which Paul can provide. But what do you think about the reported number of pay-per-view buys for the Paul and Woodley rematch? And what do you make of Masvidal's response? According to Francis Ngannou's agent, his spat with the UFC is not all about the money. There's been a lot of bad blood between Francis Ngannou and the UFC this year, despite Ngannou currently holding the heavyweight title. Ngannou is nearing the end of his UFC contract, and so far, it doesn't look like a deal will get done prior to his last fight on January 22nd against Ciryl Gane. But Ngannou's agent, Markel Martin, says the whole thing is not about the money. This is what he said while on the Throwing Down podcast with Renee Young and Misha Tate.
And let me make this clear, it's not all about money. It is 1,000% not all about money, and they know that. But at the end of the day, UFC has a business model. That's how they run it with all their fighters. They can't, put themselves in a situation to establish precedent that negatively reflects them.
Martin goes on to talk about one of the big sticking points in the negotiation standoff, and it's the fact that Ngannou, in their eyes, simply isn't given enough opportunities to fight. He says Ngannou wants to be more active in the UFC and more chances to get into the octagon. Let's backtrack a bit, as Ngannou won the heavyweight belt by a knockout of Stipe Miocic in late March of this year. Immediately after, hype surrounding a potential fight against former light heavyweight champ John Jones hit a fever pitch, but that fight never materialized. It seemed because of money. Just 72 days later, a little over 2 months, the UFC crowned an interim heavyweight champion in Ciryl Gane. For now, Ngannou does have a heavyweight title unification fight scheduled for January 22nd against Gane, whom he also briefly trained with in the past. But what do you think about Ngannou's agent's words here? Don't forget to take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel to stay up to date on all the latest fight news. Chael Sonnen says Charles Oliveira gets hit a lot, and that could be his downfall against Justin Gaethje. Talk of Charles Oliveira defending his UFC lightweight title against Justin Gaethje is heating up. But will the highlight reel present enough problems against the champ that would see him earn the title? Former fighter Chael Sonnen believes that if Gaethje can touch Oliveira enough, he has a shot at finally being called the undisputed UFC lightweight champion. Case in point, this is what he had to say about Oliveira in regards to getting hit.
Numbers don't lie, and Charles Oliveira gets hit a lot. He gets hit a lot more than most other champions. Charles Oliveira does not have some Chris Lieben-esque chin that he's known for. He reacts like a normal human being, which is he falls down and he's hurt. None of that's a knock on Charles. It's something that we have to be aware of because Justin Gaethje is damn good at touching people.
Prior to his fight against Dustin Poirier, there was some talk about how Oliveira, quote, quits in fights. And while he has proven to be a resilient fighter who can come back from adversity, there have been times when we've seen Oliveira in trouble early due to strikes. Earlier this year, in his fight against Michael Chandler, Oliveira was hurt in the first round and ended that round on the ground defending from strikes, before he ultimately came back to win via TKO in the second. We saw it also in the Poirier fight, as the Diamond landed strong punches to put Oliveira in enough trouble in the first round and got the better of him in many of the exchanges in the second, before, again, Oliveira came back in the third to take the W this time via submission, although Oliveira did deliver a lot of strikes himself. Gaethje hits like a Mack truck and loves sitting in the pocket and just throwing, oftentimes landing flush and strong, which could spell trouble for Oliveira if he gets caught. But what do you think? Do you believe Oliveira has enough holes in his striking that Gaethje could exploit to his benefit and ultimately pry the lightweight title from the Brazilian? Or do you believe Oliveira has what it takes to get the job done and secure his second title defense win? Dana White challenges Jake Paul to take PED tests for 2 years in exchange for White testing for cocaine for 10 years, from the fighter to the boss man himself. UFC President Dana White is no stranger to trashing Jake Paul. The two have been going back and forth in the media over pay-per-view numbers and the treatment of UFC fighters in regards to their fight purses. With each and every win in the boxing ring, Paul has gotten louder and louder in his criticism of the UFC and Dana in particular. After he knocked out Woodley on December 18th, a former UFC champion, Paul prodded White to let a few UFC fighters enter the boxing ring against him, claiming that he would, quote, pay them their fair share. But it's what he said next that got White fuming. Paul accused Dana White of being a cocaine abuser. Well, Dana White was recently in an interview on the Fight with Teddy Atlas podcast, and he inferred that Paul uses PEDs to prepare for his fights. He went so far as to issue a challenge to Jake Paul and said this.
I got a challenge for Jake Paul. So this guy keeps saying that I'm a cokehead, right? He can randomly cocaine test me for the next 10 years if I can randomly steroid test him for the next 2.
The criticism isn't without merit. Before Woodley was tapped to fight Jake Paul, the YouTuber was actually scheduled to take on Tommy Fury. In an interview weeks before the December 18th fight, Tommy's father flat out said that Paul refused to take a PED test beforehand. Ultimately, Fury had to bow out due to injury, and Woodley stepped in to save the day with his face. With regards to allowing contracted UFC fighters to step into the ring, Dana White said no way will he let that happen and told Paul that instead, he should box actual pro boxers. But what do you think of Dana White's challenge to Jake Paul? Let us know in the comments below. Chris Weidman thinks Jake Paul should be calling out Anderson Silva. After Jake Paul knocked out Tyron Woodley in their rematch earlier this month, the YouTuber turned boxer started calling out a few UFC fighters again. But one guy who believes that Anderson Silva would be the perfect next opponent is Chris Weidman. The All-American, a former foe of Silva's who stopped the Brazilian's dominant UFC middleweight title reign back at UFC 162, is questioning why Paul isn't calling out Silva. Case in point, while on his Won't Back Down podcast, this is what Weidman had to say.
But he's calling out all smaller guys on him. Anderson Silva is not in contract. He's a professional boxer. He's been looking great. He just beat a world champion in his last fight, a former world champion. That's a former world champion boxer. And they're right around the same weight, same size. Like, why aren't we hearing him call Anderson Silva out? I would love to see that.
Silva is a long-time MMA champion and bona fide legend of the sport. He's also a professional boxer with 3 wins and 1 loss. He's also been pretty active this year at the age of 46 with a split decision win over Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. in June and a knockout victory over former MMA fighter Tito Ortiz in September. At this point, Silva is fighting because he loves the action and has nothing else to prove in combat sports, so a fight against Jake Paul, who keeps saying he'll take on anyone, seems to make sense if the money's there, especially given that both men are pretty similar in size and weight. What do you think about Weidman's belief that Jake Paul should call out Anderson Silva? Would you like to see this matchup? And if it does get booked, who do you think will have their hand raised at the end of this one? Thanks so much for joining us today and catching up on all things MMA. What do you make of what's going on in the fight world? Make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel to stay up to date on all the news from the MMA world. See you next time.